When I was in middle school, my dad surprised me one day by telling me that he wanted to take me to an exhibit that was visiting Atlanta, an installation called Dialogue in the Dark. Created in the 1980s by a social entrepreneur who was keen on building empathy and understanding for those who are blind. Dialogue in the Dark was an immersive experience in which sighted people and blind people trade places. After arriving at the exhibit and stowing away all of our belongings, we were ushered into a small waiting room with other nervous participants. The room was initially lit, but after everyone had filed in, a voice over the speakers came and said, "Starting now, notice how much you rely on sight in the course of an ordinary day." The lights around us slowly dimmed as the voice continued on. Notice how much this costs you in terms of your other senses, which you are about to use as you may never have used them before. Do what your guide tells you and enjoy your dialogue in the dark. By the close of this introduction, the room had become pitch black. A new voice startled me. The voice of a person who I discerned was less than a foot away from me, but whose approach I could not tell because of the darkness. She introduced herself to me as Sally, shared with me that she would be my guide throughout the journey, and told me that she herself was blind, but that she knew every single inch of that museum like the back of her hand. For the next hour or so, I did my best to follow Sally's voice as she navigated me through the many corridors that replicated real-life scenarios. A grocery store, a subway station, a park, a bar, and a traffic crosswalk. But her voice surely did not prevent me from running into walls, missing doorways, jumping at sudden noises, and even tripping over the cane that they provided all of us. For an hour, I fumbled around in the dark. And that's what Lent sometimes feels like. Last week at Virtual Coffee Hour, Katie Booth shared what many of us either probably were or have thought at some point in time, something I share with you all now with her blessing. She said, "Can someone tell me what exactly is Lent? Can someone get me a Lent for Dummies book or something?" For many of us, Lent feels like fumbling around in the dark. We know we're supposed to do it every spring, but it may feel like running into walls and missing doorways. Lent is this season leading toward the death and resurrection of Christ, this 40-day chapter of the church's annual life, when we remember that Christ himself was tempted in the wilderness for 40 days and for 40 nights. It's a time when we journey together in our wilderness, together with one another and together with our sin. Each year, faith communities embark on this arduous Lenten journey by joining together on this day, Ash Wednesday, the day when we commit to two things: becoming keenly aware of our sin and becoming keenly aware of our mortality. Something many of us understand probably more this Lent than that of any before it. And Lent really is a beautiful journey, taking us to a beautiful destination, Resurrection morning, Easter Sunday. But before we get there, we have to journey with our sin, journey with one another, and journey with our darkness. I think darkness has gotten a pretty bad rap because of the many "come inside, kids, it's getting dark out there" that we all surely got growing up. Because of the fear of the unknown and because of our dependence upon our eyesight, we are collectively afraid of darkness. And darkness has become a sort of catch-all for psychological, emotional, relational, and spiritual difficulties. Oftentimes, people don't know precisely what they mean when they refer to darkness as a concept, except that they want to stay far away from it. Theologian Barbara Brown Taylor once said of darkness, "The dangerousness of the dark is like the law of gravity. No one can say exactly how it works, but everyone agrees on it." And the church, well, we've made a bit of a mess of it ourselves. For the church has made a binary of light, dark, good, bad, holy, sinful, and shoving all of the sinister stuff into the dark part, identifying God with the bright, sunny part, leaving us to deal with the rest. From the earliest times, Christians have used the word darkness as a synonym for sin, death, and ignorance, explicitly stating and implicitly implying things about dark-skinned people and sight-impaired people that are not true. This binary offers people of faith a giant closet of sorts in which we can store everything that threatens or frightens us without thinking too much about it. It's almost like we think that God made a mistake in making half of time itself swim in darkness, or that God only accidentally gave us other senses with which to experience reality, or that nocturnal creatures have nothing to teach humankind. We are so afraid of being afraid, and so we flee from the dust, from the disaster, and from the darkness. But the Bible does not let us so easily flee. Psalm 51 is a familiar picture of the very dust, disaster, and darkness that grounds our faith. It reveals a psalmist who is running from memories of their own sinfulness, missing the mystery of God's grace, jumping at sudden realizations, and tripping over their own insignificance. Psalm 51 reveals a psalmist who is keenly aware of the darkness within themselves. A few months ago, I was privileged to share a conversation with Reverend Stephen Cady, the former pastor of this very congregation, who was sent as what they call a hospice pastor, meaning that it was Stephen's job to bring this church to a close. But as history and legend tell us now, Stephen's dynamic preaching and his effective leadership brought about the growth of this congregation. In very Kingston leader-launching fashion, Stephen is now leading one of the largest Methodist churches in the area. And so, near the end of my conversation with him, I asked him, "When you reflect on Kingston now, when you think of Kingston, what is it that you think of? What is it that you see now about this particular community that you didn't see before when you were actually here?" His response startled me. He said, "Kingston knows how to struggle well." I did the very eloquent and pastoral thing I often do when I'm met in surprise by wisdom. I said, "Huh?" He continued. He said, "When I first arrived at Kingston, there were 8 people in the sanctuary on a good Sunday, including me, my wife, and our firstborn in her belly. There were days I'd get to our sanctuary and it was freezing cold. I realized that our boiler didn't work, so I'd scurry down to the basement and bang the thing into submission." Kingston knows what it's like to feel that death is an ever-present reality. And so they are not apathetic, nor do they hold on to unnecessary traditions. Kingston knows what it's like to hold their own mortality in tension with their passion for life. Kingston knows how to struggle well. The resurrection of this very community began in a coal sanctuary. The resurrection of Jesus Christ began with his 40-day, 40-night temptation in the wilderness. Resurrection does not begin with stones that have been rolled away, with empty tombs, with running women and the masses bewildered in amazement. No, resurrection begins way before that, friends. Resurrection begins with knowing our own sin. Resurrection begins with knowing our own mortality. Resurrection begins with darkness. In 1924, a boy by the name of Jacques Lucieron was born. He was an ordinary boy by any measure and did ordinary boy things. And so when he was 7, he got into a fight with some other boys at school. But in this fight, he fell hard against the corner of his teacher's desk, causing irreparable damage to both of his eyes, and he was left completely and permanently blind. Jacques went on to be a prolific public writer and thinker, eventually becoming a French resistance fighter, founding an organization that thwarted Nazi Germany's attempts to sway the opinion of the French people. At the end of Jacques' life, when he was asked how and why he was able to overcome this injury, he shared a memory of his parents. He said, "My mother learned Braille with me, and she learned to use a Braille typewriter. She never pitied me or called me unfortunate. And my father said something to me that changed my life forever. Immediately after the doctor told my father that I would be blind for the rest of my life, he simply said to me, 'Jacques, always tell us when you discover something.'" Friends, may we discover something in the dark, like I did many years ago at that museum. After about 15 minutes of fumbling around in the exhibition, something peculiar happened. Without my eyesight to guide me, I discovered my other senses as if for the very first time. When I ordered a drink at the simulation that replicated a bar, I slowly traced my thumb around the coins in my pocket, taking stock of the grooves on each of the faces to discern which to give the bartender. I discovered the intimate knowing that comes from slowly feeling a thing. Later on, after I finally found the items on my shopping list in the corridor that resembled a grocery store and realized that I need to get to the cashier station, I stopped in the middle of the aisle and listened for the beeps and the dings of the cashier. I discovered that sound is the vocabulary of creation. It was in the darkness that I discovered a deeper sense of seeing, a deeper sense of light. And all the while, Sally was there next to me. Kingston, darkness is where resurrection begins. May you learn to walk in the dark, because where darkness is, just like Sally, there God is also. And remember, always tell us when you discover something. Amen.